Okay.
Hello and welcome everyone to this special episode of High School Mathematical Oncology. I'm Isaac, and today we're diving into a fascinating conversation about how math, biology, and medicine come together to take on one of the biggest challenges in science, cancer. It's an absolute honor to introduce our guest today, Dr. Jason George. Dr. George is an assistant professor in the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Texas A&M University and leads a research group focused on using mathematical models to better understand cancer, the immune system, and how tumors resist treatment. His work blends advanced math, biology, and machine learning together, helping shape the future of personalized cancer therapy. Dr. George holds a MD from Baylor College of Medicine and a PhD in bioengineering from Rice University. He's trained with some of the world's leading cancer researchers, and today we're lucky to hear about his journey, his scientific research, and where this exciting field is headed. Dr. George, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks for that great introduction. And yeah, I just want to compliment this initiative. I think that especially for students who are young in their careers, I mean, it's not just inviting, people to give their perspective, but I think giving a platform for, students to be aware of the work that's going on and sort of to get that early interest is really exciting. So I'm happy to be here and excited to talk a little bit about what we do with you today.
okay, thank you. So, starting off of your background as an MD, PhD, what inspired you to combine medicine with research, and how did your journey lead you to study cancer using mathematical models?
Yeah. Yeah, so just briefly, I'll gear this, toward basically, high school students to undergraduates that psychology. So I think to that end, I mean, my pathway was not predetermined in a sense. At that stage, I had really no idea what I wanted to do. I followed things that I was very passionate about. So, from a very early point, I always knew that I wanted to perform research. That was sort of an aspirational goal of mine. And I also wanted to perform research that was directed at improving people's lives. And I also loved math. So I kind of followed math throughout undergraduate, got some research experiences, tried out a variety of different research topics, all of which were interesting, some of which, I found that I had more of a passion for than others. Um, and really, to answer the cancer question, I had an undergraduate research experience involving cancer modeling. It was my first experience with cancer, I'll say, at Baylor College of Medicine. I think that was my senior year of undergraduate over the summer. And so that experience was sort of transformative in a way. I mean, it really solidified my desire to study cancer, for the rest of my career. And sort of also at that time, I realized that if I wanted to do something quantitative, to a high level, I really needed expertise in two areas. So, specifically, I needed to understand mathematical theory and developing and applying sophisticated mathematical tools. But I also needed familiarity with the biology underlying tumor progression, tumor resistance, as well as the clinical implications of therapeutic resistance, the problems that challenges, opportunities, if you will, that plague the clinical landscape for cancer care. And I think these other parts were really better suited to being addressed, if you will, by formal training with the medical degree. Of course, the PhD is pretty self-explanatory, I think, with regard to the math tools. And so that's really sort of my path into that. And in the MD PhD, it's a long program, so you have about 8 to 10 years, depending on largely the length of the PhD, to decide what you want to do. I sort of refell in love with cancer and modeling, both in the MD and PhD, and really just wanted to drive impact, marrying these two skills with my research program.
Yeah, that's really cool how the two skills sort of just came together and led to your current position in research. So, in your work today, how do collaborations with researchers and clinicians ensure the accuracy of your models, and how can these models be used to optimize cancer treatment for individual patients?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, I mean, collaboration is key. So, a lot of our most exciting projects involve collaboration, and I sort of see the benefit of collaboration in several ways. So, you know, one could be completely preoccupied with developing new theoretical tools. And those tools can be directed at addressing problems, in cancer or other, biological field, biomedical fields. And that's an exciting pursuit in its own right. And we do a lot of that in my group. But those tools, they're created. There's a lot of work and it's a labor of love to develop those tools. And they benefit from, basically careful application, evaluation, sense checking, verification, if you will, using empirical data. So I guess the answer there is that the tool is being developed, even if it's being developed to understand some fundamental insight into the biologic process it was designed to, explore. There is still a huge benefit to being able to apply those tools and devote that time to doing so. And oftentimes that comes with real data, and hence the need to carefully collaborate with clinicians and also wet lab researchers. It's a non-trivial task to select the right data and to apply the tool in the right way. And so this is really a full-time effort, in its own right. Okay, so that's one aspect. Another aspect is that I think, in a lot of cases, some of the most exciting questions arise when researchers from different backgrounds get together and have collaborative discussions. And so, oftentimes, I mentioned my training before, but oftentimes you get into a room with a clinician, for example, and have an engineer or a mathematical oncologist there, and they see a problem from a different perspective. The vocabulary might be different, the problem solving or problem identification may be different. And I think it really is that back and forth, sort of banter or I don't know, active thinking, if you will, on the spot that really accelerates collaborations in exciting ways. And so without that, a lot of questions are out there just waiting for the right team to, I think, assemble and pursue.
Yeah, just looking at, I've seen some like these team collaboration meetings, and it's always so cool seeing like the ideas just bounce back and forth between everybody.
Yeah, and
And
it's that carry forward that, on one's own, right? For example, if you're solving a math problem, right, a clinician probably won't help you with the technical aspects of solving that math problem in much the same way that having a basic mathematical oncologist in the room during a surgery is probably not going to help, an interventionalist take care of the patient. So in some respects, it's also good to have sort of back and forth where you go off and you polish and you refine. But absolutely, as you say, I mean, the back and forth comes because thoughts begin to emerge that wouldn't ever have sort of come into existence were it not for getting together in that way.
so what are your thoughts on pursuing an MD, PhD for a career in cancer research? Is that like, would you recommend that path as like only path? What are some options with that?
Yeah, yeah, I guess I should expect that question after the last two. I mean, so no. I mean, the short answer is I wouldn't recommend it as the only path. I think maybe the right way to start is that there are many paths to success. So if you look at, for example, successful researchers, if you count all of them, there's probably almost the same number of paths to success as there are successful researchers because everybody, sort of carves out their own way. Um, in my high level view, it's really less about the path and maybe more about the commonalities, amongst successful people and the ones that have sort of achieved in their respective fields. And I think that, from my reflection on that, briefly, number one is you have to be passionate. So you have to really fall in love with whatever problem or set of problems that you're studying and trying to solve. So passion is one important thing. You also have to be really, have sufficient ability, I should say, at least, to be able to contribute in the field of study, right? So let me use a personal example. I mean, I love art, right? I love studying art. I don't have any skills to be a painter, right? And so as much as I find some love there, I don't have my skills don't match that passion. And so you need some level of critical skills to be able to contribute. And I think, as a corollary to that, perhaps for trainees, my main advice is be curious at an early age, explore all sorts of fields. Doing that will identify passions and also allow you to, especially for the ones that are very capable and gifted with many skills, close doors. And closing doors for people with many talents is a really useful activity, right? Because you have many opportunities to go in various exciting directions. But pursuing some avenues of interest to see what you're more or less interested in is very helpful. And the other thing is that at the trainee stage, especially at the high school and undergraduate stage, you're really setting yourself up in choosing the coursework that you want to proceed with in order to become an expert in something if you decide that your path is in, fundamental research. And so I think really early on, understanding what you're passionate about and identifying the skills that will help you, innovate and drive impact in those fields is really important. And the formal training is sort of a really exciting and protected time to do that with coursework and undergraduate and mentored research, for example. But I would say, yeah, the biggest thing is being open to pursuing new and exciting directions. So specifically, at least on the MD PhD, on my side, I think it's very useful because it allows you to learn how to think and sort of speak and work like the respective individuals in those training programs, right? So this at least has allowed me to interface with clinicians in a much more natural way than I otherwise would have had I not understood the challenges and lexicon and day-to-day, dealings, I should say, of somebody who's in a clinic dealing with real patients and treating those patients and driving, patient impact forward. So that's been very helpful. And again, I think for this audience, maybe it's a little bit more obvious why having the PhD was important. I think having a PhD in a field that is close enough to whatever your ultimate interest is very important. So identifying that before joining a program is helpful. Marrying those two things, though, I think it happened to be my path, and it ended up working out very nicely for me and my interest. But I would say that at the onset of things, it was in no way obvious to me that this was absolutely the right path for me. Nor in looking back would I say that this was the unique path. In other words, that this would have been the only path to do what I like.
Yeah, I guess that's great news for like any high schoolers who don't know exactly what path they're looking for. It's like not the path, but the curiosity and passion that really determine where things end up.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah, and if, another bit of advice early on is if in doubt, if you're unsure of what to do, right? So try it out. But also formal education is rarely a bad bet. So if you're having trouble discerning which direction you want to go in, and you're making a choice between staying in school longer versus staying in school shorter, provided you have the opportunity to do so, take the opportunity to gain more training, all else equal. And in an MD PhD program, like a PhD program, gives you in essence, a living stipend and pays for your work during the program. And so it's really there to cover the very long-term commitment of somebody who's going to be basically training in a dual capacity. But absolutely, education is rarely a bad choice.
so pivoting onto your current work in science research, what is a stochastic model, and why is randomness important when studying cancer's interactions with the immune system?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question. Okay, so what is a stochastic model? So, stochastic models are just a subtype of models that essentially account for uncertainty, or maybe I should say like incomplete information in the modeling topic of interest. So they're, contrasted or partitioned against deterministic models that basically assume that things happen exactly and precisely according to the model. To the second part of this question, I mean, the stochastic models are important and incredibly useful in almost all scientific fields. All scientific fields, I would boldly postulate, although I'm not an expert in the others. I would argue, perhaps that the reason why accounting for randomness is useful, at least in studying the tumor immune interactions that you're asking about, is probably the same reason why it's useful for nearly any other scientific field. So if I try to motivate maybe a discussion of thinking of the utility of a stochastic model, I might be tempted to provide some example. So, one example would be try to imagine if I ask you a question about what's going to happen in the future, right? And I could make it more tangible. I might say, what's the weather going to be precisely where you're standing tomorrow, right? Or what's right? Is it going to rain a year from now where I'm standing? These things we can't know for sure, right? I mean, it's impossible. It's absolutely theoretically impossible to have information that's sufficient enough to make a precise prediction on the behavior of the future time point. And so, in that way, in situations where we can't know for sure, probability and stochastic models are a really nice way of assigning a probability, a likelihood, and that likelihood is a quantification on the uncertainty. So I think that's the more maybe obvious way that stochastic models are useful. Another way that they're useful is, you know, for example, maybe another example. So it might not be that in theory you couldn't precisely describe everything, but it's just far too complicated. In other words, it might be untenable to track every single piece of available information of a system that's required to make a deterministic, certain estimate of where the system's going to end up, in the next step or next state. So maybe there a coin flip's a good analogy, and less so about the stock market of the future. So, if you, for example, take a coin, right, and you account for the force that's applied in the coin, whether or not the coin started on heads or tails, the height of the flipper away from the floor, the material on the floor, the angle that the flip happens, all of these things, the weight distribution between both sides of the coin. Maybe with all of that information and maybe with 100 or 1,000 more parameters, you would be able to reliably predict every single time where the coin's going to land, right? But even in that example, it's an incredibly complicated process to describe in all of the gory details, as it were. And so oftentimes in cases where we don't want to include all of those details, either because doing so would make it computationally infeasible, or we may overtly lack the ability to track those details, right? Maybe we don't have complete information. Stochastic models can be really useful, right? And so instead of doing this detailed calculation of where the coin's going to fall, you can attribute a probability of the coin falling on a flip, and you can then compare the distribution of heads and tails to your model. And this is a very natural way of framing, very complicated systems. And so, this is one coin flip. I mean, you can make this very complicated. If you're tracking a million coins at once, each with a different property, now you can imagine the immense computational problem. And so, I mean, using that coin flip analogy, imagine describing a complex biological system, right? Many different cells, many heterogeneity within the cells, different interactions occurring. All of these things benefit the use of stochastic models in studying things like cancer progression.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. You can't know everything, so you have to sort of account for like what you can't really describe so well.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I defer, there are experts in stochastic process theory and probability theory that I think lay this out in a much more elegant way than I have here. But I do think it's useful to sort of partition into, are there things that are fundamentally unknowable? That may be a philosophical question. And are there practically things that, despite possibly being knowable, we will lack complete information on?
yeah. So how do your models track cancer immune system interactions and predict resistance? And I guess does randomness play a role into this as well?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I guess the short answer is that randomness enters into, in many form, like both of these things, how tumor cell interactions occur, and how you predict, evasion or maybe treatment resistance. Um, all of this comes in different forms depending on the specific, data application of question, the models that you use to implement to solve these problems. So maybe I can give you, a brief example of perhaps one. So in a model that tracks population dynamics, this is studying, for example, the sizes of populations. Maybe it's a tumor that's fighting against a population of immune cells. Studying events of interest would amount to representing things like evasion or resistance. So it's really defining formally in your math model what an event is of interest, and then, basically characterizing that event. So, interactions, the interactions that you refer to in your question in that context really are derived from the functional forms that the mathematician uses to basically propose the model, right? These are in the constitutive relations involving how the function or the equation is represented, but also by parameters that govern the strength of those interactions. So, scaling factors that describe the relative importance of a particular interaction, for example. So that's one interaction, or that's one example, I should say, of how, we would do that perhaps in a population dynamic sense. Another example of this could be in, at least thinking about my own research, predicting T cell recognition of tumor antigens. So that's a very different problem. It's not tracking really the population of tumor cells and asking the question of whether or not that population will hit zero and become extinct or escape. But really, here the question is a biophysical evaluation of whether or not a T cell receptor will bind and recognize an antigen, a protein on the surface of a tumor cell and kill that cell. And so in a stochastic model, that same, this is a very different event. It's not all of the tumor dies, but it's the tumor can be recognized. That statistical event can be formally stated and then attributed some sort of probability in the random model. And so for example, and similarly for other things. So in both of these cases, if this is a process that's occurring in time, a stochastic process, then you might be able to quantify random times of interest. What is the time where the tumor becomes extinct? That time isn't a definitive time. It's a random variable, and so those times of interest are random. And so they can also be attributed an average value, an expected value, and also a variance associated with that value to give you some idea of uncertainty. And so I guess, part of that answer is really bringing it back to where stochastic models enter in this. But these are sort of the basic ways in which we account for those features.
Yeah, that's really cool. Like um seeing the interactions between them, it's like not not guaranteed because we don't know enough about it, and like just trying to gain like a better understanding of how it could work with some
Yes.
like wiggle room.
Yeah, and there's a lot of parallels with, complicated, I guess I would say physical chemistry, for example, when you're tracking a lot of molecules, right? It's complicated. There are many molecules interacting at different rates. There have been a lot of powerful mathematical models that have described, simplifying these ideas conceptually into a mathematical framework. The same thing really applies with the tumor and immune interactions in the sense that there are many tumor cells, there are many different types of immune cells, each with different specificity. And so having a probabilistic model generate predictions related to the likelihood of recognition is a very natural way, I would argue, of thinking about the problem.
In your paper, you studied T cell receptors using machine learning. How does this help in like designing better cancer vaccines or therapies?
Yeah, okay, good question. So, I mean, machine learning is one of those new, hot, I would say, off the press tools that a lot of people have been using. It's a tool. It's just like any other, sort of mathematical or quantitative tool that we use. And in some context, it's very appropriate to be using to address certain questions. And so, I think the examples that we've used that have perhaps been most prominent are in using machine learning, for example, to identify genes that might be the most important genes to describe a particular biological process. And in the case that we were interested, it was in studying the epithelial to mesenchymal transition. Um, but also, identifying genes is one thing, and then developing a statistical model that can resolve relevant, cell phenotypes for a researcher was sort of the main focus there. The machine learning came in the optimization of identifying those genes from real data, right? In a different context, machine learning can be used or has been used by our group to basically optimize a complicated model with many variables in a way that maximally resolves, a group of, say, T cells that recognize versus don't recognize a tumor antigen of interest. And so you can use machine learning and AI to basically train and optimally, inform parameter estimation of models in a very useful way. And these are the ways that we've used it to sort of make more powerful or accurate, if you will, our models. And in many cases, right, this is followed by a large and I would say very important but time-consuming process of validation, prediction, making sure that the answers that you're getting from these machine learning frameworks, sort of live up to the expectation on independent data sets.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's like there's a new tool, and I guess mathematical oncology, there's like been so many changes in the last like 15, 20 years, and this is like another tool that can help
Yeah,
with
and it's
that.
an exciting opportunity, for students that are now learning. I mean, I invite students to explore. I think now this is probably no longer a secret, but certainly the students that are coming through the math onco pathway now that are interested, the students that are your age and really haven't committed fully yet are going to be seeing these models that were never there for people like me when we were training, and so. I identify that as a really exciting opportunity for the next generation.
So you've also used AlphaFold 3 and Racer M together. How do those work, and how does clustering with TCR dist help?
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's a
So
very specific example. So, and maybe I'll try to frame that answer related to what I just said. So AlphaFold 3 is again a hot new tool that was developed, a deep learning or a large language model architecture to effectively predict the folding of proteins, and so in their three-dimensional conformations. And so there are other tools. I mean, we've used several other tools as well. But you can use these tools and I mean tools like it, let's say, to be able to make predictions on protein structure. And that's useful for us, in the very narrow sense that the models that we use, specifically the ones you're referring to, are models where we track tumor, TCR, T cell receptor interactions with tumor antigens that are presented on the surface of tumors. Tumors, I would say, for the math onco community that's interested, but we're also interested in studying things like the recognition of viral infections that similarly happen via antigenic recognition. So, in that context, the models that we have were trained and utilize structural information. The structural information arises or is derived from, I should say, real structures that experimentalists have painstakingly created using crystallization, so X-ray crystallography. So they've purified these molecules, these interactions, these complexes, and they've assessed definitively the structure. That's an incredibly painstaking and time-consuming and costly endeavor. And so you can imagine as a result that there aren't many structures that are known, specifically in this immune context, that have been solved for relative to the number of interactions that we're interested in. So they represent a very sparse set. One can use these AlphaFold 3 and similar tools to try increasing the number of structural templates one has to make predictions. And so I think that answers the first part of your question. And then if I remember correctly, you're also asking
yeah.
how TCR dist clustering helps. So there again, this is a very specific tool, in our field, and it was pioneered by Paul Thomas's group at St. Jude, and so that tool has been very useful, but sort of looks at the problem in an orthogonal, independent way. And so really, what I'd say here is that integrating these tools is key. Finding tools that sort of address or improve the ability to make a prediction whereby the tool is integrated independently from other tools and therefore provides complementary information ended up proving useful in this particular research direction. And so we were encouraged by that and sort of hybridized these tools in the need that we had, which was basically reliable prediction of TCR, recognition of tumor and viral antigens.
Yeah, I guess the first time I heard about AlphaFold 3, I believe it was a YouTube channel, Verita Serum. Yeah, and
Yes.
it was like he really emphasized how important like this could be for research and how many opportunities this opened up.
Oh yeah, and it's AlphaFold 3, so they've been doing this, they've been iterating on this for some time now, and the capabilities of these models is just going to continue to improve. And so this is a very hot and active research area right now with a lot of implications for how researchers conduct protein design, for example, or try to identify functional, clinically significant protein-protein interaction. So a lot of interesting work is going to be done here, continues to be done in that field. So stay tuned for those of you interested, I would say.
So we're running a bit short on time. So for students interested in mathematical oncology, how can they get started? Like,
Yeah, so I think let me maybe phrase this or frame it to the ones that are high school undergrad. This is probably where I want to target. So I honestly think diligent study of math is a really great way of getting started. So math oncology has math in it. It has oncology. And there are different, distributions of people that gravitate toward one end or the other. So more generally, my answer would be if you're studying either of those, it's probably time well spent, and at least it will get you familiarized with what's going on. I like mathematics in the sense that mathematics tends to stack, where basic mathematical skills sort of are prerequisite for more advanced mathematical skills. And so, in short, if you're spending your time learning new math, it's likely not time wasted. Ultimately, depending on what you want to do at the end, even if math onco isn't what your ultimate calling is, having math is always is really a good skill. The other thing is, I would recommend, at least in terms of formal coursework, taking courses at the interface. So, bioengineering is a good place because there's engineering and math principles that are being applied to problems in biomedicine that can often be cancer, that can often be things that are peripherally related to cancer. Biological physics is another really great place to gain these skills and to see, really importantly, how math is developed and applied to solve and explain, basic phenomena. Mathematical biology, similarly, there as well. I think all of these are really good options. And also, I would focus there for somebody who is computationally inclined to start. But there are also great courses purely on detailed oncology. They're going to be more cancer biology courses, or pure biology courses. I think for the person who comes with a strong background in math, oftentimes the rate of information and sort of the terms and complexity is a bit daunting. And so if you like math, I would suggest getting into that more with taking, courses at the interface first, and then diving in. And if you come more from the biology background, I would say going in the other direction with formal coursework is a great way to, ultimately gain advanced math skills. Um, I also recommend too, aside from the formal coursework, like get experience as an undergraduate in research, or if you have the opportunity as a high school student, that's excellent. At one's home institute. So if you find a project, right, that you're interested in and you can contribute on, or you can learn something from, that's enough. It's okay if it's not your forever topic that you're going to fall in love with and then develop a career in. But I think getting the firsthand research experience early on is really important, and understanding how research is conducted, and also how to think like a researcher. And that helps you determine whether or not that's a good path, and whether or not you want to, devote a large amount of your life to doing that. Um, I think, going back to the math skills, I mean, proof-based courses in mathematical analysis would be, top of my list. Again, this is more for the audience that is mathematically involved. I think those skills complement what you'll find in the lab, right, where you're developing, rigor in mathematical thinking, logic, and discovery, and it'll again benefit your problem solving abilities. And so ultimately, fear not. I mean, get the experience in as many sort of subfields as you can. Find what you're interested in, and realize that even if you discover that you're not going to carry with something forever, those skills and that time was probably time well spent early on.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that advice. And one last quick question. Where do you
Sure.
see mathematical oncology in 10 years?
Oh, okay. So one last quick. I don't know if I can address it quickly. I'll do, well, so briefly, let's put it this way. I mean, there are several important directions. So, we mentioned one earlier. I mean, we're in this exciting time of, AI driven innovation, right? So math onco models are going to no doubt help, I think, with this. And it's going to particularly catalyze the discovery in areas where traditional modeling maybe has been challenging. So some of that involves, complex systems where a lot of data exists. If I go on the data direction for a second, I think really another opportunity is that we're amassing large amounts of data, and the data sets are, everly increasing detail on the data sets. The complexity of these data sets are now, getting to be very extreme, and so this is a really exciting opportunity for people who are modelers, because there's so much that you can do in collaboration with somebody who's, experimentally deriving or obtaining these results. And the questions you can answer are so exciting because of how complex the data sets have now become. I think another tangible example of that might be digital twin technologies. So now that we're having, I guess high frequency and high detailed data on individual patients, that's really going to sort of enable our ability to personalize, therapies, to the individual patient in the clinic. Um, and then one that I would say, and kind of as a final remark, and it's one that it's near and dear to my heart, but maybe not always on people's radar, is, and this isn't a new opportunity. This has been in existence for a while, but it's the development of novel mathematical frameworks using contemporary math to address new questions. So I think that's always going to be there. You have mathematicians, pure and applied, developing new mathematical theory that needs to be understood and processed by people with first-class mathematical skills to then be able to apply and perhaps extend in domain areas of expertise. And so you can imagine this requires dual areas of experience in math at a very high and first-class level, but also detailed underlying biology, and in this case, in the process of understanding what cancer is required, and pairing those things as an art that over time one becomes more seasoned with. But I think developing the math skills to a very high degree is prerequisite.
Yeah. Dr. George, thank you so much for your time today. It's been great hearing from you and seeing where mathematical oncology is right now, where it can go, and how high schoolers and undergraduates can get involved. To all our viewers, whether you love math, biology, computer science, or just want to make a difference, there is a place for you in the field of mathematical oncology. Thank you so much for watching today. Stay curious, stay passionate, and we'll see you next time.
The pleasure was mine. Thanks so much for having me. Take care.